begin then with the lecture. We are very close finally to the end of Genesis. We're getting there. In fact, today we'll finish up Jacob's story and get into Joseph's story, and then we'll finish up on Friday, and we'll be finished on Wednesday before the exam, and we'll be finished with the first book of the Old Testament. 4 weeks in, there's 39 books total. We're on track to be done sometime in 2023. Unfortunately, the class ends before that. The first Genesis takes a lot of time because there's so much narrative there, and there's so many things that set up for things later. So we spend a lot of time in Genesis, but we'll get through most of the rest of the books during the semester. But so we'll finish up Genesis on Wednesday. For today, we are picking up where we left off on Friday, which is just after the account of Jacob and all of his wives and his children, his sons being born. If you remember, Jacob ends up running away, fleeing from Esau when his brother wants to kill him, and his excuse for going is to find a wife, and he does in fact find a wife or four. And he wants to marry Rachel, and that his father-in-law Laban pulls a fast one on him, and instead of getting Rachel, he ends up marrying Leah, her older sister. And then he still wants to marry Rachel, and so he marries Rachel, and he ends up working 7 years thinking he's getting Rachel and gets Leah instead. And then he works another 7 years to actually get Rachel. And then he's also kind of later, the two servants given to his wives by their father get kind of lumped in, thrown in, because they want to have more babies. They want more children. And so he ends up with 4 wives, and he works 14 years to be able to marry Leah and Rachel. And then he stays on with Laban for another 6 years after that. And at the end of the 14 years, Laban comes to him and says, "You've been working for me this long, but that time is up. What do you want your wages to be to stay on with me? You've worked the 14 years that you had to marry the 2 daughters. What do you want your wages to be to keep working for me now?" And they work out an agreement where Jacob gets certain members of the flock, certain animals born to the flock. In fact, he gets all of the animals that basically aren't spotless white. So if they have a speckle or a streak, they have some kind of skin or some kind of fur on their body, hair on their body somewhere that changes color, or they're just all over brown or black. Whatever color they change, if they're not white, they go to Jacob. And so they make this agreement, and Laban, trying to pull a fast one on Jacob, immediately after making this agreement, goes and separates the flocks out and gives all of the speckled, spotted, and colored animals to his sons to take care of somewhere else, so that Jacob is only left with spotless animals. And obviously the descendants of the spotless animals are more likely to be spotless, and so Laban's right at the outset trying to screw him out of wages, trying to keep him from getting anything out of that deal.
Quit making deals with this guy.
Yeah, you'd think at some point, but I mean, yeah, Laban is definitely Jacob's match. Jacob is the trickster, the one whose name means trickster, but in Laban, he has definitely met his match. But God takes care of Jacob. Laban is definitely trying to mess him over, and in fact, later when animals are being born that keep going to Jacob, Laban thinks he's getting messed over in this deal somehow, even though he set it up so that Jacob would get the short end of the stick. Laban keeps trying to change the wages, change the agreement on him to keep Jacob from being able to keep these animals that are being born. So Jacob's flocks keep growing and growing and growing, getting stronger and stronger and stronger. He becomes wealthier and wealthier and wealthier over this 6-year period. And by the end of this 6 years that he's working for Laban and his other children, his sons, are getting angry at Jacob because his flocks are growing and Laban's are kind of flattening out. The curve has stopped going their way. The flocks aren't growing as much, and Jacob's are exploding. And it's all because God has blessed him. Laban has done his best to mess him over, but God has blessed Jacob anyway, and his flocks keep growing and growing and growing. And this causes a lot of jealousy, and Jacob gets to be afraid that they may resort to violence at some point soon. And so he's getting ready to just kind of go. He's about done with Laban. And one day, God speaks to him and tells him that it's time for him to go. And so he says, go back. God tells him to go back to Bethel, go back to the place that he had seen the vision of God and the staircase between heaven and earth. And so later, Jacob tells his wives, and it tells Leah and Rachel that God has said to go, and he's ready to leave. But they're leaving their family and their homeland, so kind of letting them know this is the plan, and what do you think? And the girls, Leah and Rachel, say, our dad kind of traded us off to you for labor to get what he wanted out of you, and he's tried to mess you over ever since. He's treated us kind of like livestock, and we got no real attachment to this place anymore. We're good. We can go. And so they all decide to pack up and leave. And not only do they decide to pack up and leave, but Rachel goes in and steals all of the household idols from her dad, from Laban. And these are the statues, the idols made probably out of, some would be of stone and wood probably, but with a wealthy person, it'd be much more likely to be precious metal like silver and gold. So Rachel goes in and steals these things, and then they take off without telling Laban they're leaving. They just load everything up, they get all the herds going, and they leave. And Laban is far enough away that it takes him a day or two to realize that they're gone. But once he realizes that they're gone, he rounds up a lot of the men able to fight in his household, and starts chasing after them to bring them back. Well, it takes several days to get there, to catch up to them, because they've got a head start. And on the night before he catches up, God comes to Laban in a dream and tells him that he is not to touch Jacob or any of his household. In fact, he's not even to say anything bad to him, not to curse him. And so, God tells him, warns him off of doing anything violent to Jacob. And the next day, Laban catches up to him and kind of chews him out for leaving suddenly without saying goodbye, and taking his children and grandchildren away without saying anything. And Jacob says, well, I was afraid that you might come and try to capture me and bring me back. Like, I just imagine the scene as Jacob kind of tiptoeing, looking over his shoulder at the army he's got behind him, and says, well, I was afraid it wouldn't go well. And, that was exactly Laban's intent, actually, without God's intervention. But he says, I was afraid it wouldn't go well, that you would come and capture us and try to bring us back. And Laban says, well, also there's the matter of the idols that have been stolen from my household. And why did you steal the idols and take them? And Jacob has no idea what he's talking about. Jacob doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know that Rachel has stolen these idols. And so he says, I have no idea what you're talking about. Feel free to search the camp. If you find your idols, the person who stole them, you can kill. Put him to death for being a thief. Not realizing that it's his favorite wife that has actually stolen them. And so he sets up, it says, go and search. And so Laban starts searching. He searches through everybody's tent, everybody's stuff, and he's not finding them. And he comes to Rachel's tent last, and he searches through Rachel's tent, and Rachel has hidden the idols in her saddlebags. And she is sitting on the saddlebags in the middle of the tent, and she says to her father, forgive me for not standing up, but I'm on my period. And so he won't search the bags. He doesn't want to make her stand up or leave or search the bags that she's sitting on. So he searches everything else in the tent, everything else in the room, and then leaves and never finds the idols. Says, well, basically, I guess it must not have been you. I don't know where they are. So Rachel gets away with stealing Dad's household idols. Later, God tells them to get rid of all of them, and so they bury them under a random tree somewhere, and nothing else ever comes from them, but Rachel doesn't get caught. And so Laban, eventually they make an agreement between them. They set up this monument and say, this is our boundary marker. I won't come, neither one of us will cross the boundary to come against the other to fight and to take. And so if we cross the boundary, it has to be in peace. And so they make an agreement, they make a covenant between them that this boundary will be the boundary between their territories, and they both go their separate ways. And Jacob starts to go back towards his father's land. And there's one more hurdle ahead of Jacob. Remember how he left Esau. Esau wanted to kill him because he had stolen the birthright. He had conned him out of the birthright. And then he and Rebekah had conspired together to con Isaac into giving Jacob Esau's blessing. And so Esau felt like Jacob had just stolen everything important from him, and Jacob was just his enemy, the worst thing that had ever happened to him. And he was enraged and ready to kill him. He was just waiting until his father died and the period of mourning for his father was over before he murdered his brother. And so he was fleeing for his life when he went to Laban. And so now he's coming back, and he's coming back to Esau, coming back to the land where Esau lives. And so he is desperately afraid that Esau is going to want to murder him. And so he sends a group of his servants ahead to go and meet Esau and to send his best regards and to let him know that Jacob is coming home. And so the servants go, they meet with Esau, and they come back and they tell Jacob, Esau, he received your message and he got up and started coming this way, and he's bringing 400 men with him. And Jacob starts thinking, why does he need 400 men to come say hello to his brother? I don't think he's coming to say hello to his brother. Why would you bring specifically 400 men and not like your family to meet a long-lost relative? If you're bringing 400 men, you probably intend to fight. You're probably specifically coming to kill him. And so now Jacob, his fear in his mind, his fear is confirmed. His brother is coming to fight him, to kill him. And so he starts making preparations to meet his brother on the way. And one of the things he does is he divides his camp. He splits the flocks in half. His various animals, he splits them into two different groups. And so he's got half his sheep over here, half his sheep over here, half his goats over here, half his goats over here, and so on, all the way down through all of his animals, cattle, donkey, camels, everything he's got, splits it in half. Servants split in half to watch over all the animals. And his purpose in doing that is that they're all going the same direction, but he's keeping them separate so that if Esau attacks him, then maybe hopefully one of the groups can get away and he won't lose everything, assuming he survives. And so he splits them up and they're traveling on, and then as they get they come to this place where there's a river separating that's in Jacob's way as he's traveling, and he knows that it's only going to be a day or so before he meets up with Esau. And so he makes this kind of final round of preparations. First of all, he takes some animals from his flocks, big numbers of them, and sends them as a gift ahead. Starts sending them ahead of him, and then he organizes his family and puts them in a particular order so that the ones that he likes best are at the back, so that they're most likely to be able to get away. And he sends all of that across the river to go on ahead. And so he sends this massive train of animals as a gift, and he has them separated by a little bit so that they're coming to Esau one after the other. You got a flock of several hundred sheep coming first, and then several hundred goats after that, and then several dozen camels, and then several dozen cattle, and then donkeys comes after that. There's several of these flocks of animals that he's sending ahead of him as gifts to Esau to kind of butter him up, and they're all separated so that Esau is running into them one at a time and seeing these big groups of animals being sent to him as a gift from his brother. And the goal is to kind of assuage his anger and to buy off his affection, maybe to keep him from wanting to kill him. Maybe by the time he gets there, he's seen all this stuff, he won't want to murder me, or he'll at least be willing to talk. So he sends all that ahead, and then he sends his family, his wives, and his children ahead of him. And he sends Zilpah and Bilhah, the servant women, with their children first. And then he sends Leah with her children, and then he sends Rachel with Joseph at the very back. Again, because the ones at the back are going to be furthest from the fighting if it breaks out, and they have a better chance of getting away. And so he's organized his family according to his preference for their survival. And that Jacob has a bad problem with favoritism, as we'll continue to see. And then he sends all of everything ahead of him, and finally he's the last one left on the other side of the river. He's the last one left behind, and he's going to cross over. And then all of a sudden the story gets a little weird. Something happens that's unexpected. This guy randomly shows up. This man shows up and starts wrestling with him. Literally just comes up. Apparently, just comes up and starts grappling with him and wrestling with him. And they wrestle and they wrestle and they wrestle and they wrestle all night long, apparently. And by the end of it, instead of the man grabbing Jacob and holding him down, it ends up being Jacob that won't let go of the man. And so Jacob is now clinging onto and wrestling with the man. And when it comes time for the sun to rise, it's about daybreak, the man finally says, "Let me go, it's daybreak." And Jacob says, I'm not letting you go until you bless me. And this guy, we find out as the story goes on, but especially by the time we get to the end of it, we find out this guy is God. God has come in the shape or the form of this man and wrestled with Jacob all night long right before he goes to meet his brother, while he's afraid of being killed by his brother. And so he wrestles with God all night long, and in the morning when it's time, when God says, let me go, Jacob says, not until you bless me. And then the man, God, reaches out and pops him in the hip and dislocates his hip. And so Jacob has to let go. And so then the man gets up and Jacob says, well, who are you? What's your name? And the man looks back and says, why are you asking my name? The kind of subtext there is, you already know who I am. And then the man blesses him, and as part of the blessing, God changes Jacob's name to Israel. And so after this, all of the descendants of Jacob, all of the sons and the grandsons, great-grandsons, so on, the whole descendants, all the family line of Jacob are called Israelites, or just Israel. The nation of Israel, the people Israel, are all descended from Jacob. And that's the name Israel comes from this event where God changes Jacob's name. And the name Israel, you remember we said the other day, El at the end or the beginning of a Hebrew word. What does it usually mean? What is it? God, yes. Usually it's an abbreviation for God, the Hebrew word for God. And Israel means struggles or wrestles with God, which is kind of, in the story, it's very obvious why, this name, the connection. Jacob wrestles with God all night long, and in the morning he's blessed and his name is changed. But it also kind of hints at, points to this kind of longer term relationship where the people of Israel are going to struggle and wrestle with God. Israel is going to have a very long, very complex relationship with God. They're very frequently going to mess up, and God is going to deal with them, and so they're going to be struggling and wrestling for centuries in this relationship with God. And so they are God's chosen people, but sometimes that being the chosen people doesn't really seem like a compliment all the time. They mess up a lot, and God deals with them over it. And they struggle and they suffer a lot as a result. And so that name, Israel, struggles with God, that becomes the name not only of this man, but of all of the people that come from him. And as I mentioned the other day, the 12 sons that I listed off, those sons, all except for Joseph, their names are going to be the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. Everybody descended from them will be part of their tribe, and they make up Israel. And so this scene ends where Jacob's been wrestling with God and his name is changed to Israel, and he crosses over the river, and I'll give him credit here. He sent everything over in the order that he thinks it's expendable, right? His wife Leah, or wife Rachel at the very back with Benjamin. He does at least go ahead of his children after this. He passes up his wife and children and gets in front of them, and he's going to meet the man he's afraid is going to murder them all, and he goes in front of his wife and kids. I give him kudos for that. If he had just stayed at the back, I don't know that I'd have had time for Jacob after this, and that would just not have been okay. But Jacob gets ahead of the rest of his wife and his children and goes and meets Esau. And Esau, when he sees him coming, Esau gets down and comes running at him. And instead of drawing the sword and attacking him or anything, Esau comes and embraces him, gives him a hug. And so they are reunited, and Esau starts asking, who are all these people? What is all this around you? He says, wife and kids. I had a few. I went to get married 4 times and had lots of children. This is my wife and family. And then Esau says, well, what was with all the flocks that I kept encountering on the way here that kept passing me? And Jacob said, they were gifts so that you would, well, he doesn't say this, not murder me, is what he's probably thinking. What he says is that I would find favor with you. And Esau says, I've got my own flocks. I don't need all this. You keep what's yours. But Jacob insists that Esau takes the gifts, and Esau agrees and takes the gifts. And this meeting goes well. Nobody's murdering anybody here. It's clear though that Jacob doesn't quite trust Esau. He doesn't think that Esau, or he's not willing to trust his safety to Esau's good graces. Because Esau offers and wants to travel back with him, to come back with him, seems to be to spend the time with him traveling back. And Jacob says, no, don't do that. There's no need in that. My flocks have lots of young in them. I have small children. We're going to be traveling at a snail's pace. You don't really want to do that. Just you go on back and we'll catch up with you later. And then Esau says, well, at least let me leave some of my men to come with you and help you on the way and to protect you. And Jacob says, no, that's not necessary. We don't want these men with their swords loyal to you, all with us. You just go and we'll catch up with you later. All that I want to know is that we're fine and that I have your favor. And so he goes, that's kind of the end of that scene, and they move on. So Jacob has reunited with Esau, and he comes and travels on through, and he ends up settling in a place near the city of Shechem. He buys a plot of land near Shechem and settling there instead of going on to Bethel like he was told to do. So he finds this plot of land near Shechem, and he buys it, and they settle there. And it turns out that the king of Shechem has a son who gets to be infatuated with Dinah. Dinah is Jacob's Jacob's daughter by Leah, the only daughter that he has that's named in the text. And so, don't know if he had others or not. It'd be kind of weird to list all of these children and to specifically list Dinah and then not list any other daughters that he has. But then it would also be kind of weird to have 11 out of 12 children all be boys. And so, I mean, you pick your weird. Either way is kind of a weird way to go. So it's, Jacob has this daughter named Dinah, and the son of the king of Shechem is attracted to her, and so he rapes her. Those two do not, automatically follow. But no, the son of Shechem rapes her, and then he decides that he is in love with her and really wants to marry her. And so Jacob finds out about this rape when the father and son come to him and want to negotiate the wedding, to find out what it would take for the son to be able to marry Dinah after raping her. And so Jacob doesn't do anything at first. He's there in the camp, and all of his sons are out working in the fields and with the flocks, and they're not there. And so he just kind of sits there and doesn't really respond, doesn't do anything until that evening when the sons come back. And when the sons come back, he tells them what happened and what they want, and that the son of the king of Shechem is saying, whatever you want, whatever dowry you want me to give for her is fine. Make it as high as you want. I'll happily pay it, as long as you'll let me marry her. And the sons hear what has been done to their sister, and they are livid. They're ticked off that their sister has been raped, as most older brothers would be, right? So they're ticked off, and their father doesn't seem to be coming up with any plans or solutions. He's obviously angry about the situation too, but he hasn't done anything. And so the brothers, some of the brothers at least, get together and they make a plan. They go to the king of Shechem and to his son, and they say, look, we can't intermarry with you. We can't have our sisters and daughters marry your men, and we can't marry your daughters and sisters. We can't marry the women of your city, because anybody in our household, anybody connected to us has to be circumcised, and none of you men are circumcised. And so if you want this to be a possibility, you have to be circumcised, and then we can talk about arrangements. Then we can talk about intermarrying. And the son of the king of Shechem is so infatuated with Dinah at this point that he's willing to make that happen. And so the son and the king go to the city gates and start talking to the influential men there, and they kind of convince the men in the city that if they intermarry with them, not only will this big family, this huge family and household stay nearby, but over time they'll be able to kind of incorporate their flocks and their wealth into the city, and everybody will benefit from it. Everybody will get rich off of it. And so they make this plan. They decide that this is worth doing. We're going to all get circumcised so that we can intermarry and kind of absorb this family. And so they do. They text actually says that the son of this king wastes no time in carrying it out. And so they go and they get circumcised. All of them in the city are circumcised. And there's a thing about circumcision. I mean, it's a minor surgical procedure, right? I mean, you can have it done now. I mean, it's normally done like in the hospital. When a boy is born, the circumcision is usually done within a couple of days, and then often the recovery is just by the time they come home from the hospital, they're fine. But we have the benefit of pain relievers, anti-inflammatory drugs, and antibiotics. So we can keep it clean and keep it from swelling and keep the pain down. They had none of those things. I mean, people chewed on willow bark. That was pain relief. I mean, before we had modern medicine, before we had drugs and could formulate chemicals the way that we do now, people chewed on willow bark, and it contained some of the active ingredient in aspirin, and that was pain relief. And so they didn't have anything for pain relief. They didn't have anything for sanitation. They didn't know they couldn't kill off bacteria, and they couldn't prevent swelling. And so after being circumcised, men spent several days recovering, and they were extremely sensitive in an area that you can't really walk without moving. And so you kind of just laid out. I mean, men just kind of recovered in bed for a few days afterwards. And during this period of recovery and pain, two of the brothers go and kill every man in the town. Chances are it wasn't just the two brothers, but all of the servants that were with them, all of their guys that helped them in the fields. And so it probably wasn't just two against the town. It was probably 20 or 30 total against the town. But still, I mean, they come in and they slaughter every man in the whole city, every man and older boy, and leave behind only the women and children. And then after they're done with their killing, all of the other brothers come in and start helping with the pillaging, taking all the valuables, gathering up all the people's animals and flocks and adding them to their own herds, and grabbing even the women and children and carrying them off as captives. And so basically they just totally sack this town after convincing them to get circumcised to weaken them, not because they actually intended to join with them. And so they've used the sign of the covenant in order to deceive and attack this town. And after they've done all this, Jacob finds out about it, and he is livid with his sons because he is terrified that all of the other cities in the area are going to hear what has happened, and they're all going to band together and as one big army come and just wipe out Jacob and all of his household, everything connected to him. They're just going to come in and kill Jacob and all of his sons and wipe them out. And so he chews out his sons and is going after them, saying, don't you know that you put us in this situation, that all of these cities are going to come and attack us now? And the two brothers that were involved in the killing of all the men in the town look back at their dad and say, what would you have us do? Just let them treat our sister like a prostitute? And then that's the end of the chapter. That's the end of the story. It's like there's no resolution there. There's no kind of final who's right, who's wrong. But it does kind of show us some of Jacob's foibles. He is going to, we've already seen one, right? He shows really ridiculous levels of favoritism, first to his favorite wife, and then later, as we'll see, to his favorite son by that favorite wife. And so Joseph is going to be his favorite kid, and that's going to cause all kinds of jealousy and problems. And so Jacob shows a lot of favoritism like his father Isaac did. Remember, Isaac liked Esau and Rebekah liked Jacob, and that led to lots of conflict and even led to the whole stealing of the blessing because Rebekah connives and schemes, creates this scenario where he steals the blessing, and then that leads to the hatred between Esau and Jacob, that Esau wants to kill Jacob. And so Jacob is imitating his father there. But then also remember, the other thing is that Jacob just doesn't do anything when he finds out that his daughter has been raped. And in that, he's like his grandfather, Abraham, who just totally abdicated responsibility when there was conflict in his family. When Sarah was mad at Hagar, he just says, she's your slave, do what you want with her, instead of stepping in and protecting the mother of his child. And then later, when Sarah does ultimately want to send her away, he still abdicates responsibility until God tells him, it's okay, do what Sarah says, and I'll take care of him. I'll take care of your son. And so Jacob ends up imitating his grandfather in totally abdicating responsibility and just not doing anything and letting somebody else take care of it. And two of his sons do take care of it. They kill every man in the town. And so we're seeing that all of that, even though these are the patriarchs, they're the ones that all of Israel looks back to for their origin. And most cultures, when they look back to a single person or a family line as a kind of their heroes or their patriarchs, the place that they come from, they'll draw them in these kind of larger than life, over the top, powerful or wealthy or righteous lens. They'll make this kind of caricature of them so that they are amazing, the perfect people. And Israel has not done that. I mean, that's not what we get in Genesis. These patriarchs are very flawed. Abraham has issues with lying about his wife and about abdicating responsibility for his family. Isaac has problems with showing favoritism to children and other issues. Jacob has a laundry list of issues involved, including deception, being a liar and a trickster, showing favoritism, and not being willing to step up when the situation demands it. So abdicating responsibility for stuff. And so he is a very flawed man, as all the men that we'll see, all the people that we'll see in the Old Testament are. But now that this situation has happened with Dinah, they can't stay in Shechem anymore. They're afraid that everybody's going to attack them. It turns out, the text tells us, that the result of this family coming in and being able to totally wipe out this one town is that all the other towns are terrified of them and they don't want to do anything to them. They're not going to touch them, but they are really happy to see them leave. And so Jacob loads up his family and they leave the area of Shechem and they finally go back to Bethel, where God was telling him to go in the first place. And they get to Bethel and they settle there. And then after they settle in there, a couple of sadder things happen. First, I mentioned last time that the 12th son of Jacob, Benjamin, is born to Rachel. Rachel finally gets to have a second son after Joseph, but she dies in childbirth. And so this is where that happens. Benjamin is born and Rachel dies immediately after in childbirth, after they get back to Bethel. And then after that, Isaac, Jacob's father, also dies, and Jacob and Esau together bury him. And so Rachel and Isaac die, and then we're given in chapter 36, there's a kind of a rendition or an account of Esau's descendants, Esau's family line. And then we come to Joseph. And at this point, Jacob is still alive, and we seem to be kind of jumping back in the past a little bit, because we're going to talk a little bit about Joseph's mother still being alive in this text. I mentioned of her still being alive. But we're going to center on Joseph, and we're going to be hearing about Joseph's story primarily. And Jacob will come back into it later, but primarily we're dealing with Joseph now. And Joseph is, of course, the first son of Rachel, his favorite wife, and so Joseph becomes Jacob's favorite son. And the favoritism gets to be kind of over the top, ridiculous. The first thing that we see Joseph do, first time that we're introduced to Joseph in the text, is at 17 years old. He goes and sees what his brothers are doing in the fields and comes back and tattles on them, gives their father a bad report about what his brothers are doing in the field. If any of you have a younger sibling that tended to be a tattletale, you'll probably have some inkling of what the brothers feel at this point, except for they're adults now. Joseph is 17, they're even older, and so their anger isn't just, let's go have a wrestling match or fist fight and work it out. They're angry. They're really ticked. And then Jacob gives Joseph this coat. And it's usually called the coat of many colors, or if you prefer, you're a fan of musicals, it's the Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Whichever you want to think about it. There's actually a little bit of weirdness or uncertainty in the translation. It could be that it was a coat with many tassels, whole lots of decoration. It's not real clear what this coat actually was or how it was made, but it is real clear that it was a special, flamboyant, flashy, expensive garment that Jacob gives to Joseph. And none of the other brothers have ever gotten anything like this. It's real clear that he is Jacob's favorite. And so they hate him even more. And then Joseph starts having dreams. And in one dream, he is out in the fields with his brothers and he's harvesting grain. And if you guys have seen wheat grow, and if how much you drive around in the country, I have to pass by wheat fields to get anywhere, actually. There's no direction I can go without going past farms. But wheat is a form of grass, actually. And it grows up, and it grows these kind of tall stalks, and then at the top of that stalk will be a head with a whole bunch of kernels of grain in it. And the way that they would harvest it is to reach low and use a scythe or a knife to cut near the ground. And so they would cut this tall stalk, this thin stalk that is hay, and then the head at the top. And then they would take all of those stalks that they'd gathered with all the heads on top and tie them together, and that tied together bundle would be called a sheave. And then they would take the sheave somewhere else and they would break it apart, and then they would take and beat the heads of grain off of the top and separate it. And that was a threshing process to separate the grain from the chaff, the leftover stuff, and then winnow it to get rid of it, and you would end up with your grain. But when they're harvesting in the field, they bundle it all together in these big sheaves. And in his dream, Joseph sees, he bundles together, ties together the sheave, and then his sheave stands straight up, and his brother's sheaves all kind of gather around it and bow down. And when he gets up, he tells that story to his family, he tells that story to his brothers, and his brothers immediately know what the dream means, and they're ticked at him about it and say, "Are you saying that we're going to bow to you? That we're going to serve you? Are we going to be your slaves?" And so they hate him even more for the dream. And then he has another dream, and in this dream, he's looking at the sky, and he sees the sun and the moon and 11 stars that all come and bow down to him. And this time, his dad gets involved in it. His dad kind of gets onto him a little bit too, and he says, "Are you saying that even your mother and I will bow to you?" The sun and the moon. So Jacob is interpreting it. Is it even your mother and I are going to bow to you? It's a little extreme, son. And so even his dad gets onto him a little bit, but his brothers just really hate him. And then one day, his dad sends him out with a bundle of provisions for his brothers. They're out with the flocks in the fields and taking the flocks around to graze. And his dad sends him out with a bundle of provisions, but probably also to spy on them, and because he knows Joseph will come back and tell him what they're doing. And so he sends Joseph out with his bundle of provisions to go and check on his brothers, to give them the stuff some food and drink, and then to check on them. And so Joseph does his traveling, get out to where they are. It takes him a while to get there, a couple days to get there actually. And when he gets there finally, his brothers look up and see him coming from a long way off, and they hatch a plan. At first, they say, "Here comes that dreamer. We're out in the middle of nowhere. Nobody can see us. Nobody's going to know. Let's kill him. Just get him out of the way. We'll just kill him, and we won't have to deal with this mess anymore." And at first, that sounds like a good plan. But then the eldest brother, Reuben, the oldest, says, "Well, he is our brother. He is our flesh and blood. And if we kill him, that may cause all kinds of problems. God may even take vengeance on us. And so let's not do anything that will make us guilty of his blood. Here's a cistern." A cistern, by the way, is a hole dug into the ground. It's usually kind of carved out to be very open in the bottom, but then narrower at the top, and its purpose is to catch rainwater. And when in Israel you get lots of rain, lots of water all at once, and then none for a while. And so it was kind of important to be able to store the excess rainwater when it came, so it wouldn't all evaporate away, and you'd have some left over for later. And that's what a cistern is. Instead of a well that goes down all the way to a source of water underground, it's just a big kind of catch to catch rainwater and store it to use later. And this cistern was apparently pretty empty. And Reuben, the eldest, says, "Let's just throw him in here, and then we won't be guilty of his blood, and we can go do whatever, and then whatever happens to him, happens to him." And his brothers all agree to this, and Reuben's plan is to throw Joseph in there and then come back later without the brothers and pull him out and take him back home and rescue him, basically. The brothers are too angry to be reasoned with and to talk him down from attacking and hurting Joseph, and so he's going to keep him from killing him and then rescue him later. And so he throws him in there, and then Reuben goes off to try to come up with a plan for getting Joseph out. And while Reuben is gone, the rest of the brothers, while Joseph is in that cistern for a while, the rest of the brothers look up and they see this caravan of traders, Midianite traders, or descendants. It's actually some Ishmael's descendants. are trading, and they're on their way to Egypt. And Judah, one of the other brothers, makes the recommendation, says, let's sell him as a slave to these traders. They'll carry him off to Egypt. We won't have killed him. We won't be guilty of his blood, and we also won't have to deal with him ever again. And we'll get money in the bargain. We'll get to split a purse over him, get a few silver pieces. And so the brothers all love this idea. It's all a great idea. They pull him out. They sell him to the traders, and Joseph is carried off into Egypt. And when Reuben comes back and realizes what they've done, he is terrified and torn up. It's like, what are we going to do? What are we going to tell Dad? And so they strip Joseph of his special coat, and then they take knives and they shred it and tear up the coat, and then they take a goat, one of the young goats, and they kill it, and they splash the blood, grind the coat in the blood, and then they take the bloody, torn coat back to their dad and say, was this Joseph's coat? And of course, yes, Jacob recognizes it as Joseph's coat, and they convince him that a wild animal had mauled their brother and killed him while they were gone, and while he was on his way to them. And so Jacob is convinced that Joseph has died, and he grieves and is so torn up about it. I think, this is kind of speculative, but I think that Jacob's reaction convinces the rest of the brothers they regret being involved in this. They regret doing this because they see how devastated their dad is by Jacob's death, or Joseph's death. And then Jacob then attaches to the second son, the son that Rachel bore and died in childbirth with, attaches to him and becomes super protective, overprotective, and Benjamin becomes a new favorite. But Joseph is taken into Egypt, and he's sold into the household of a man named Potiphar. Potiphar is the captain of the guard for Pharaoh, or the king of Egypt. And so he's one of the highest ranking officials in Egypt. He's the guy that is responsible for training and keeping soldiers that are going to be the personal bodyguards of the king. And so he's very important, very influential. The captain of the guard is always somebody that you want to keep happy if you're the king, because if your enemy can turn the captain of the guard against you and convince the captain of the guard to kill you, the guy that's responsible for your protection is trying to kill you, you really have no chance. You're going to die. And so the captain of the guard is somebody that you always want to keep happy when you're the king. And so he's very important, very influential, usually pretty wealthy. And so Potiphar is a wealthy, influential official in Egypt, and Joseph is sold into slavery in his house. And Potiphar very quickly realizes that Joseph is very skilled, and everything that he does seems to come out well, and he seems to be blessed. And everything that he touches becomes very efficient and multiplies. It goes really well. And so he ends up putting Joseph over his entire household. Everything in his house is subject to Joseph, except for himself. And so he puts Joseph over his whole household, and everything goes really well. Potiphar's house starts thriving. But there's one hitch, one issue. Turns out Joseph is a pretty good looking dude. He's strong, he's well built, got a handsome face, and Potiphar's wife becomes infatuated with him. And she comes in, one day Joseph is inside the house, and she says, "Come sleep with me." And Joseph refuses, says that it would be evil, it would be wicked for him to do that. Potiphar trusts him so much, and it would be a sin against his master and against God to come and do this, to sleep with her. And so he refuses and leaves. But then day after day after day, Potiphar's wife tries to convince Joseph to come sleep with her. And then one day, either just by chance or because Potiphar's wife has arranged it, all the servants are gone from the house. There's nobody inside when Joseph comes in to do his work. And so Joseph and Potiphar's wife are alone in the house, and she comes up and grabs a hold of him, grabs a hold of his clothes, and said, "No, really, come to bed with me." And Joseph slips out of the cloak, the garment that he's wearing, and runs out of the house. Well, Potiphar's wife starts, when the servants start to trickle back in, and then later when her husband comes in, she starts telling the story that Joseph tried to rape her, and when she screamed, he left his garment behind, and see, here's the proof that he came to do this. And so she falsely accuses him of rape. And Potiphar, when he hears the story, he is enraged. But if you read between the lines in the story, it's kind of clear that he's not really mad at Joseph. In fact, instead of killing Joseph, which a slave accused of rape would very easily have been executed, I mean, that would be no problem, especially for the captain of the guard. No problem. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he puts him in prison, and not only in prison, he puts him in Pharaoh's prison for his political prisoners. And usually a political prison is not the worst kind of prison. It's usually kind of a swank thing, at least more so than a regular prison. And so he puts him in this kind of secluded prison with other political prisoners, and then later the captain of the guard entrusts Joseph with two other very important prisoners and make sure that they're taken care of. And so it looks like Potiphar's not actually mad at or has an issue with Joseph. It looks like he's mad at his wife because he knows. And so because of the culture, he can't take his slave's word over his wife's word, and so he has to punish Joseph. But he knows that it's not really Joseph's fault, and so he treats him actually really well, and then this whole scenario works out for Joseph to be removed from prison, relieved from prison later. With that, that's where we'll stop for today, and we'll pick up and finish Joseph's story in Genesis on Wednesday. If you hadn't hit the sign-up sheet, hit it on the way out, and if you have any questions, I'm up here.